Hello, everyone. This is recording number 8 for Aristotle, a class on the Nicomachean Ethics. Today's topic is Aristotle's discussion of what is voluntary and also what is, in one way or another, not voluntary. So, this takes us to chapter 1 of book 3. The chapter starts with the claim that those who study virtue are concerned with actions and affections. And that should not surprise us in a way. We have been reading book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics on the virtues of character, and we saw that we are, on the one hand, concerned with actions, but also with pleasure and pain, and more broadly speaking, with affective attitudes. But even though this shouldn't surprise us, we immediately get an additional thought here. Aristotle says that we who study virtue are also concerned with how we respond to actions. And in today's terms, we would say that we are concerned with so-called reactive attitudes. He says that we respond with praise and blame to what is voluntary, and we respond with sympathy to what is countervoluntary. So he is here introducing a distinction between two categories: what is voluntary, what is countervoluntary. And then he goes on to make things more complicated by introducing two further categories, namely what is non-voluntary as opposed to counter-voluntary, and what is a mix of voluntary and counter-voluntary. These four categories are extraordinarily contested. Scholars have raised any number of questions about them and disagree greatly on how we should even approach the chapter. I'm going to set aside a lot of questions that ultimately I think are also interesting. For example, scholars have asked whether Aristotle is working towards a conception of responsibility here. Scholars have also asked whether maybe Aristotle is to some extent responding to the Socratic paradox that wrongdoing is ignorance. And then Aristotle's response would be, well, sometimes, but not always. But I'm setting that aside, and I want to go through three approaches that I think are especially important to consider. One is what you may call a philosophy of action approach. It is a major question in today's philosophy of action whether we can figure out the difference between action and movement. What precisely should we say about that distinction? And in that discussion, one of Aristotle's examples from Book 3, Chapter 1 has been quite influential. Aristotle asks us to envisage someone who is, as we're picked up by a storm or wind and carried somewhere else. So we might think the person is moving, but she's not acting. And if we look at those kinds of examples, we may ask whether Aristotle is working towards a conception of human action. Here's the second type of reading that I want to just lay out a bit. You can call it a virtue theoretical reading. After all, the beginning of the chapter says that we are studying virtue. So we should assume that somehow what we are doing in this chapter is still concerned with virtue. And we may think that, yes, one important way in which we are concerned with virtue is that we are looking at praise and blame, reactive attitudes. And in addition, Aristotle is also concerned with what today we might call self-directed reactive attitudes, such as regret. And the idea that that is also something that a theory of virtue should consider is maybe one of the most influential dimensions of Aristotle's ethics, that what today we call moral psychology is actually an integral dimension of getting clear about normative matters relating to virtue. Another way in which we could defend a virtue theoretical reading is to say, well, in book 2, which was sort of primarily about the virtues of character, Aristotle said, and that was in chapter 4, that someone who performs an action from justice, not just performing a just action, but performing it from the virtue of justice, does so from a decision. The agent has made a decision, but he still owes us an account of decision. And Chapter 2 of Book 3, in fact, is going to give us this account of decision, and it is part of this account that actions which an agent has decided to perform are a subclass of the voluntary actions. So we might think that what we are doing in Chapter 1 of Book 3 is a kind of preparatory step towards a conception of decision, and that might be a key component of a theory of virtue. Third reading. Chapter 1 of Book 3 has been extraordinarily influential in the history of legal thinking. Right at the beginning of the chapter, when Aristotle says, well, we study virtue, we study praise and blame, we study what is voluntary and countervoluntary, he says, this is also going to be useful for those who are legislators, who ought to frame laws. And we can see why that would be. He is, like in the chapter, thinking through cases and what are the distinctive dimensions of a case that is, let's say, countervoluntary or non-voluntary. And he's thinking through different ways in which ignorance can be involved. Is someone acting because of ignorance or in ignorance? And so on and so forth. And many of the cases that he studies have really become paradigmatic cases in the discussion of legal distinctions. So I want to end this recording with a question, namely whether, notwithstanding further puzzles about Aristotle maybe developing a notion of responsibility and so on and so forth, notwithstanding all that, whether it might be possible to combine the action theoretic reading, the virtue theoretic reading, and the philosophy of law reading, and whether that might get at least at a lot of important dimensions of the chapter.